This lecture follows the fall of Rome and the rise of Byzantium, when Constantine will move his capital of Constantinople there in 337 Common Era. The sack of Rome in 410 Common Era was devastating for the Western Empire and sounded the death knell for the Romans in the West, whose livelihood survived largely on agriculture and agrarian means. The Western Empire thus falls, leaving warrior lords to pick up the pieces and carve up the territory that once was held by one massive geopolitical entity. The Eastern Empire, however, known as Byzantium, will last for another millennium. Centered in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul and Turkey, we have a Greek-speaking version of Christianity that will be carried on when Constantine legalizes the religion and then makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. The West he covets, and we find the Byzantines will try to reconstitute here shortly. The Byzantine Empire and its art can be divided into the Golden Ages. The first one of early Byzantine art will last from 527 to 726. This is going to correspond with the rise of Justinian as emperor and the consolidation of his power to iconoclasm. Justinian is going to be a very important emperor for the Byzantines in the East, for he establishes the official religion of Orthodox Christianity as the only legal religion, stamping out all other sects, including the Arian Christians and the Monophysite. He also is going to attempt to reconstitute the Roman Empire as a whole, sending his generals Belisarius and Narses to expel the Ostrogoths, Vandals, Bulgars, Sasanians, and to revive the glory of old Rome in New Rome. And what is amazing, of course, is that they have a measure of success in actually doing so. Now, once again, we find that the Mediterranean Sea was a Roman lake. Certainly Justinian wants to show himself as a world conqueror, to reconstitute and reclaim the glory of the Roman Empire in his new Rome. Here, in Justinian as world conqueror, or the Barberini ivory from the mid-6th century, we have many Roman imperial sources. The emperor sits on a horse in an equestrian portrait much like that of Marcus Aurelius, with the bountiful earth beneath his horse, showing that when he is in charge and in control, that peace and prosperity will give up the earth's bounty. Next to him, we find a palm-bearing victory, or a Nike-like figure is going to be crowning him, whereas barbarians seek clemency below, cowering at the might of this emperor. Above, we find that a beardless Christ is going to be blessing the actions of this emperor, held aloft in this roundel by two angels. All of this is going to be taken from earlier iconography from emperors, now blessed by God himself. This new Rome is going to use the iconography of earlier emperors to communicate the power, the prosperity, and of course the justification that these emperors had for conquest. In order to cement his name in the records, we know that Justinian wants the largest, most grand cathedral ever built, and he's going to hire Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus to do so, and that becomes the Hagia Sophia, one of the most famous structures in the East. Here, we must note that these elements are not part of the original plan, which include minarets and buttressing. We know there was an earthquake, and so we had to reinforce part of the structure. When the Turks take over Constantinople in 1453, renaming it Istanbul, they convert this massive Christian Orthodox cathedral to a mosque, whitewashing the interior and introducing new Arabic elements. The design, however, is for a Christian Orthodox church and is like nothing that came before it. We know, of course, that Justinian hires these two architects, one being a theoretical professor of mathematics at the local university. and it is meant to rival all churches that were ever made before, as is recorded by his historian. It surpasses in scale and magnificence, according to Justinian, the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which is the touchstone for all great architectural structures, because of how impressive the description is of the Temple of Solomon in the Old Testament. Turning to a plan of the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom, we can see that it is 270 feet long and almost as wide. It does have a longitudinal pull along the nave and the central axis, but is not as long as Old St. Peter's in Rome. Instead, it is going to be vertically oriented and more centrally planned. Its dome is 108 feet wide, and then 180 feet from the pavement below. A massive interior space that lets in and bathes the interior space with light. The effect, even after it was whitewashed and the golden glimmering mosaics removed from the interior space, is still bright and airy. With 40 windows below the dome, we let in this ring of light, as well as from the walls below with light ashlar masonry. Procopius, the Greek historian of Justinian, tells us that it appeared as though it was a golden chain that was lowered from heaven. And, of course, the light is very important for Orthodox Christianity, for it is the presence of God inside the structure. Pseudo-Dionysius tells us as such in his The Divine Names, when he states that light comes from the good, and light is the visual image of God. So we know that light here on earth is going to reflect and radiate from the effigy, the face of God, reflecting through the mirrors of the angels until we see earthly light here, that faint glow that's going to come from God himself. Now, the way in which we are able to get so much light in the interior space here at the Hagia Sophia is going to be a new technology of engineering by the Byzantines. Now, throughout Byzantine history, they will use either pendentives or squinches to build their massive structures. In this early phase of Byzantine architecture, we are using pendentives, from Latin pendere, to hang, in which, of course, you find the dome and these great piers are going to hang from the structure, which transfers the weight from this massive dome to the piers beneath instead of to the walls. What this allows then is for the walls to be opened up if necessary for windows, letting in even more light to the interior space. Here, if we compare the Hagia Sophia to the Pantheon, we should note that the Pantheon is a hemispherical dome on a drum made of solid concrete. Therefore, it can be wider because it is transferring the weight of this dome equally to the drum on all sides. On the other hand, Hagia Sophia's dome is hemispherical and it sets on pendentives. Hence, it is going to distribute the weight to 4 specific points at the edges of the dome, not equally across a drum. Therefore, it cannot be as large. Also, the Hagia Sophia's dome is going to be penetrated by windows at the base, further weakening it so it cannot be larger. The interior effect, then, is going to have the Pantheon letting in one oculus, or one circular area of light that shifts throughout the day, and it is the only light source unless the door is open as well. At the Hagia Sophia, we note that light comes in radiating from all angles, from the base of the dome, to the walls, to the apses. The interior space before the advent of electricity is bathed in light here. The plan, importantly, of the Hagia Sophia takes important precedence from the Pantheon and Old St. Peter's, or a vertically oriented central plan, such as that in the Pantheon, with a massive open interior space, and combines that with a longitudinal pull and orientation of a Roman basilica that was transferred and converted for Christian use. Now, the reason why the Hagia Sophia looks so different from those Roman Catholic churches in the West is the nature of the Orthodox liturgy. In fact, the laity in Orthodox Christianity does not worship in the center of the structure. Instead, that is set aside for the clergy and the imperial family. And remember, in the East, as with Rome itself, Back thinking of Octavian and Augustus, the first Roman emperor who was named Pontifex Maximus, the emperor in the Byzantine East is the head of the church. So we find that there is a procession that begins in the narthex, where the imperial family will meet the clergy and walk around the center of the structure, while we, the laity, are off to the This can be seen in modern-day Orthodox Mass ceremonies and other liturgical processions, in which the clergy are going to walk around in the center of the structure, burning candles, swinging incense burners, and chanting in Greek. We know that in the Hagia Sophia, the emperor would join the clergy, process together down the nave, showing that he is God's select person here on earth to oversee this liturgy, and that he would present gifts of gold to the clergy. Deacons would then bring the Eucharist blessed by the bishop. Therefore, seeing this procession, hearing once again the chanting, seeing light pouring in through the windows, smelling the sweet smell of incense, looking at candles burning, we are catching glimpses of heaven on earth with this royal retinue and the clergy. However, the original mosaics do not survive intact at Hagia Sophia, being whitewashed by Muslims who took it over in 1453. To understand what it originally would have looked like, we must look elsewhere. The best surviving Byzantine churches, in fact, are not even in Constantinople or the Greek-speaking East. They are in Italy, specifically northeast Italy, where we have the sacred fortress of Byzantium, as it is called, that is held by the Byzantines for nearly 2 centuries, and that is Ravenna. We know that his general Belisarius is going to capture Ravenna in 539, and they hold on to it. Therefore, the churches built during the time of Justinian can be seen here, kept intact in Christian hands. In fact, this area was ruled by exarchs or governors that carried out Justinian's will, and so artists, even though he never stepped foot here in Ravenna, will show him as part of the liturgy. San Vitale is going to be dedicated by Bishop Maximinus here, and is named for San Vitalis. In 547, we can see with this dedication the plain brick exterior facade that would imitate and look like other early Christian churches, like St. Paul outside the walls or St. Peter's in Italy. The plan is going to be a central one, although it does have a longitudinal pull. It is designed with 2 concentric octagons that overlap one another, that might at first look dissimilar to basilicas in the West, but have the same vocabulary and terminology to identify. For instance, we still have a narthex, just like at Old St. Peter's, that introduces us to the space that we walk through and is important for processions in the Byzantine Orthodox tradition. We still have a nave in the center and side aisles, as well as an apse, that semicircular protrusion where the high altar will be, and then we have sacristies on either side, which is where the bishop, priests, and acolytes robe up before ceremonies. The interior of San Vitale gives us a much better indication and record of what Byzantine churches would have originally looked like before they were converted into mosques. For instance, we have colored marble from floor to the walls to the ceiling, as well as colored columns and marble that's going to be used to decorate them as well. Mosaics decorate the sides of the walls, the spandrels, lunettes, and apse. The rich decoration is much like surviving Roman basilicas from the 5th and 6th century, such as St. Apollinaire Nuovo in Ravenna as well. Here we find processions of these martyrs are going to flank either side of the wall, and originally a rich golden mosaic would have occupied and would have been located in the apse here. Apses, of course, always represent heaven. The difference in the liturgical needs of the Greek Orthodox faith and that of the Roman Catholic can be seen here, as looking from the largest area, the apse, out into the central nave at San Vitale. Note that we cannot see the sides of the structure. Our view is limited. And of course, in the Roman Catholic tradition, this is not the case. Our view is unobstructed, allowing us to see the priest who remains stationary at the top of this design, elevated on a platform where the high altar is. This, of course, is going to reflect what we would have seen in the Hagia Sophia, where the laity only catch glimpses of this procession in the nave, as they would be behind two sets of columns pushed off to the side. So we see that the priests, the acolytes, and of course the emperor and imperial family would be walking in circles in the Here we have an example of these Greek processions. Note, of course, that all the congregation is pushed off to the side and looking to the central section of the nave to witness what is happening with the Greek Orthodox liturgy. Decorating the interior space and what we would be seeing while witnessing these processions in the nave are going to be mosaics made of thousands and thousands of small pieces of colored glass or stone known as tesserae, often also covered with actual gold. Here, the mosaics, which are very durable and for which the Byzantines will be called throughout the Mediterranean to decorate other palaces and even mosques. Here they show the holy ratification of Justinian's rule, as well as Christ's redemption of humanity in the main apse, again representing. Looking up into the apse, we see that Christ is going to be seated in heaven surrounded by clouds, angels, and saints, while below he looks down upon Justinian and Empress Theodora. Here we find a standard apse mosaic, which is common in Italy in the 5th and 6th century, which has Christ in heaven identified as a golden background with colored clouds above him, 4 rivers of paradise streaming from his orb throne, whereas we have a lush green set of greenery surrounding him, as well as peacocks, symbols of everlasting life, for it was believed that their flesh was incorruptible. Surrounding Christ, we have 2 angels who also are going to introduce Saint Vitalis, for which this church is named, and Bishop Ecclesias, often. Christ here is going to continue that tradition we discussed of philosopher, in which he is shown youthful and beardless, the early Christian version of Christ. He holds a scroll with 7 seals, as described in the book of Revelations 5:1. He sits on an orb of the world, representing his second coming when he returns to judge. He is going to be identified with a cruciform halo, which is reserved only for Christ, while other apostles and saints and angels might be identified as holy figures and as spiritually significant by halos. Only Christ has one with a Greek Orthodox cross, or the equidistant arms or bars of this cross behind his head. His eyes, of course, are going to be proportionally very large, and his face small, as he is framed with his face with his brown hair. The bishop next to him offers a model of San Vitale to Christ in this donor portrait, or a portrait of the person who paid to have an image created or a building constructed. He has on his head, identifying him as someone who has renounced worldly fashion and esteem, a clerical tonsure or shaved head, common among monks in the Middle Ages, especially Benedictine ones. The angels, Christ, and these earthly individuals are not shown as naturalistic or as representational. We are not trying to communicate a trompe-l'oeil effect or an illusionistic understanding of a picture window here. Instead, we are communicating this anti-naturalistic late antique style that becomes that early Christian style, taken even further in an iconic fashion by the Byzantines here. Below Christ, we have Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora, whose mosaics flank the high altar, even though they never visited Ravenna, are here shown as taking part in Mass, as part of the Eucharist. Off to the left of the high altar, we have Justinian, Bishop Maximinus, and attendants. A very excellent example of Byzantine mosaic art, in which it is made up of thousands of colored pieces of stone and glass, a very durable medium, and then of course gold being added to the surface wherever possible. Behind these figures, in the golden paten that the emperor holds, and in their robes, in the Bible that is encrusted with jewels held by a priest here. We find that at the left we have the secular members of the retinue of Justinian, whereby his soldiers, his private guard, are going to be identified carrying a shield with the kyriota, or the monogram of Christ's name, his first three letters of his name in Greek. We then find that the emperor, dressed in purple, wearing red shoes, is going to be picked out as the most significant person. He is holding the golden paten of the Eucharistic bread. Hence, he is part of the liturgical session of Mass here, part of the bishop then blessing this golden paten, which will then become the body of Christ. Bishop Maximinus, who's going to be here to establish this church, is identified by name above his bald head as he holds a bejeweled crucifix here, a cross that would be carried in the procession. Justinian and the others are identified by way of their hierarchy because they overlap one another. Justinian has a halo, he is wearing a crown of jewels, and is picked out wearing purple, the color of royalty and the most expensive dye for fabric. It is obvious that he is the most significant person because no one else overlaps him. He is hieratic, solemn, and still. The rigid frontality seen here, as the figures are going to be staring out at us, is going to be accompanied by a lack of a background. Note that there is no setting for these figures. Even the ground plane, which is green, does not have shadows cast upon it, and there is a lighter halo almost, a glowing effect around their feet, which is going to thwart our ability to judge where they are in space. Only the hieratic notion of overlapping indicates their positioning. Therefore, the Roman naturalistic penchant for anecdotal detail is here lacking, even though each one of these images is a procession. The style used and adopted here is that late antique, anti-classical style, which is iconic, showing us figures that are weightless and speechless, solemn and quiet, as they stare out at us, flanking one another in this bilaterally symmetrical fashion. They do not occupy real space, their bodies flattened out. They're communicating the significance of these figures by way of these iconographic conventions and symbolism, instead of realistically showing. The reasoning for this comes from Theodulf of Orleans, who in 790 writes, "God is beheld not with the eyes of the flesh, but only with the eye of the mind. Hence we are not attempting to show them naturalistically, but instead we are showing the spiritual reality behind this world that is more significant, more weighty and true." However, the further down the social ladder we go, the more naturalistic things become and that we can represent people, such as Theodora and her attendants, the Empress here, who is going to be an equal shareholder in power and authority according to Justinian and the historians of the day. Yet she is still not the emperor. Therefore, with her entourage, we find she carries the wine for the Eucharist and is located within the baptismal font and the area just outside of the high altar. She is followed by her entourage of women, her maidservants. Therefore, we have a distinct motion and movement from the right of the composition out into. The setting is going to be the atrium, where we're going to be suggesting movement. Because we have a lower social rank, it is less rigid. Surely we see that she is going to be positioned in a frontal fashion, her face looking out at the viewer, but her body is positioned in profile as she turns to walk towards this baptismal font, followed by these individuals suggesting this motion. The notion that the emperor and empress would be the significant participants in the liturgy is still carried on here as in the Hagia Sophia. The significance of them carried out and identified by their golden halo, by their bejeweled crowns and headdresses, by their purple cloaks. But like the ancient Egyptians, social conventions will dictate that the further down the social ladder we go, the less rigid these formulaic and hieratic conventions become. Therefore, the empress can appear more naturalistic. Here, the Virgin Theotokos and Child between Saints Theodore and George is going to represent a type of Byzantine art that is much more portable and influential. This is going to be carried throughout the known world, making its way all the way to Scandinavia and, of course, all the way to the West. In this particular icon, we have small portable paintings that are commonly commissioned by the Byzantines for private and for public use. The rigid frontality that we saw with the mosaics is here carried on in small scale, as we are encouraged to interact directly with these holy figures. Now, an icon is going to be a small painted panel to be used in private and could be held in one's hands or prayed to directly. The style is going to be carried on from that iconic, anti-naturalistic, late antique style, as figures are going to be shown frontally and flat. Space is squeezed out of this form. There is no negative space or background. Instead, we understand the figures as organized next to one another because they overlap, not because we're using intuitive perspective or atmospheric perspective, for instance. Just like the example of Justinian, the more rigid figures who are more important are going to stand rigidly frontal and stare blankly outward. The strict frontality and solemn demeanor here is going to belie the compressed space which is squeezed out in this planar compression, but still allows us to understand that we can access these holy figures, that there is no space in heaven. Here we note that the Madonna and Child are enthroned. She is shown as a Byzantine emperor wearing red shoes, for only the emperor could wear red shoes. She looks up into her left. The Christ Child stares out as a small philosopher holding a scroll in his left hand, blessing us with his right hand. Two saints flank them on either side. They look at us. They engage with us. Therefore, we pray to them. We pray to the saints who were human and can intercede on our behalf, introducing us to the Virgin Mary, whereby we see the angels direct our attention upward to heaven, where God the Father, his hand comes out. Thus, we gain access to these holy figures and can get to heaven in this wonderfully stair-stepped example towards the divine. The love of images the Byzantines are going to have will come to a halting screech in 726 when there is an imperial ban on them. The opposition to icon worship taking up again because of the charges of idolatry and the prohibition of images and against graven images in the second commandment. Now, at this time, in the 8th century, we must remember that 2/3 of Byzantine territories were lost to the Sassanians and the Arabs. Leo III is going to claim that God was punishing Christians for their idolatry, for we must remember that the infidel, according to the Orthodox Christians, also shunned representation of holy figures, and to this day you still do not show Muhammad or Allah. This lecture continues Byzantine art and the Golden Ages with the Middle and Late period. Picking up where the last lecture left off, the Byzantines lost 2/3 of their territory to Arab Muslims, especially in the southeast, as they spread across the Middle East, spreading the name of Allah and Muhammad. Because this new heretical religion, as the Christians saw it, did not allow representational imagery in the religious structures, especially trying to represent Allah or Muhammad, iconoclasm is then going to be instituted in 726, a ban on religious imagery in churches altogether in the Orthodox Byzantine East. Leo III is going to explain why this could have happened, stating that God was punishing the Christian Roman Empire for their idolatry, for their violation of the second commandment, the prohibition of graven images. The familiar symbols of Christianity were instead used after the mosaics were removed from the interior of these Byzantine churches. Crosses and other symbols that are not representational took the place of images of Christ himself. In the Middle Byzantine period, from 843 to 1204, we have the repeal of iconoclasm until the Western Crusaders occupy Constantinople. In this period, we have Basil I, the emperor who restores the Roman Empire in the Great Renovation. He refurbishes the decorations that were defaced, destroyed, or neglected by the iconoclasts that came before him. In architecture, several new churches are built to expand the Byzantine religion and empire in the Middle Period. Here, the monastery churches at Hosios Lukas are going to have structures that serve the monks in this monastery as well as the parish or the town surrounding them. The type of churches seen in the Middle Period are known as cross-in-square churches, for they are going to have a Greek cross inside a square. Now, in the Middle Period, we find that we no longer have plain brick facades or exteriors that were common in Christian decoration and architecture going back to Constantine, modeled on Roman basilicas. Now we find that they are going to be decorated like Islamic architecture, showing that they are influenced by this Eastern culture. The technique seen here in Hosios Lukas is going to be cloisonné, which is a term to describe light stones framing dark red bricks, giving us a much more engaged and dramatic facade, more in line with what was appreciated in the Near East. The plan itself contains several churches. Not only do we have the Church of the Mother of God, or the Theotokos, we have the Church of Hosios Lukas, or the Church of St. Luke and Styrus. This is going to be the Middle Byzantine example that we will use to illustrate where architecture evolves and how it. In the plan here of the Catholicon of Hosios Lukas, the central church, we have the Greek cross plan. Hence, we have equidistant arms of the nave and the transept. In this instance, and very commonly in the Middle Byzantine period, resting on squinches. Now, squinches are going to be a cube-like design that spreads the weight or distributes it more broadly along a cube on which a dome rests. Hence, it has thicker piers than pendentives and less windows. There is not as much space in between the arches. Therefore, not as much light can enter and penetrate the interior Middle Byzantine. Here we still have the same terminology and vocabulary used for Christian churches, with the nave in the center, aisles off to the side, a transept crossing the nave, and then the apse where the high altar is. We even still retain the narthex or entryway to get into the aisles and nave proper. What changes, however, is the way in which we move our eye ascending upwards as we have a cross and square plan, or circle once again inscribed within this cross. So we have repeated squares that move us up and up and up until we eventually reach the circle of heaven. Circles are infinite. There is no beginning nor end. Therefore, they're going to represent heaven in its golden magnificence, with archangels surrounding Christ, who's holding a book, now bearded with his blessing of benediction. The interlocking spatial units here show squares within squares. Thus they get smaller, pulling us upward from scenes representing the life of Christ and the apostles below, up to him ascending into heaven and eternity. Now, the decorations of Hosios Lukas do not survive intact. For the best surviving Byzantine mosaics, we turn to the Church of the Dormition, Latin for sleep, because it is dedicated to the Ascension or Assumption of the Virgin. This is the best surviving and most famous Byzantine church because the mosaics actually survive intact, because at Daphne, Greece, it is isolated here in this provincial area. Culminating in a series of mosaics in the dome itself, we now have Christ as Pantocrator, and or as the Last Judge, the ruler of all, now shown bearded, with deeply incised lines around his face, and a frown carving his lips. He holds a bejeweled Bible here that would have been held by the priest below, and his hand no longer raises the two fingers, the middle and index finger, to bless us. It now is curled over. We retain in this instance the cruciform halo or equidistant halo that is going to show us that he is Christ, but now he is bearded and of course looks very suspiciously off to the left, his left we should state, which is where the damned are located. The damned of course are going to be the focus of his rage. But of course we must ask, why is he? In the Western tradition, Christ's bearded appearance is going to be known from Veronica's veil, a relic that's going to be kept in the Vatican, where a woman named Veronica, according to this tradition, is going to offer a cloth to wipe Christ's face on the road to Calvary, and on the cloth appeared a miraculous image of Christ with a beard. Hence, from the early 8th century onward, Christ will be shown with a beard in the West, but especially in the Middle Byzantine period, for we find the Arabs are going to be gobbling up and eating Christian territory, and so we find Christ is going to be shown much more menacingly, threateningly. The iconography in Middle Byzantine churches will move from the areas below in the walls where the square is, representing the terrestrial sphere where we live. Thus, of course, time passes and people live and die. This gives way to the side apses and then finally the dome above, where there is no time. We enter into heaven. Here below, in the Middle Byzantine period, we're going to find a mixture of the classical organic structure that was so appreciated in the Greco-Roman era with the linearity and abstraction so loved by the Byzantines. Hence, they are going to outline the figures, the musculature, the drapery with very clear contours or outlines. The painterly figures within these outlines are going to suggest three-dimensional bulk to them as they angle and foreshortened against the picture plane. However, the backdrop is going to be solid gold. We only know that we are at Golgotha because of the skull below, where blood and water pour separately out of the wounds of Christ onto, because Golgotha, where Christ is crucified, literally means the place of skulls. Now, if we think about the earlier Theotokos in Hagia Sophia, we can see the eclectic approach brought together here as we suggest the monumental forms of the bodies of the Virgin Mary dressed in blue, looking at her dead son on the cross, while St. John the Evangelist off to the right is gesturing out at us. These bulky forms are going to also be incised and in front of a flat background. Thus we have the competing two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality in Byzantine. The non-narrative aspect of the scene is not new. Going back to the very first representation of the crucifixion, we have this devotional and intercessory role emphasized here, not as though we have Roman soldiers surrounding him and or we are about to take him off the cross. Christ will always be on the cross, always dying for the sins of Christians in this instance, and so we always are going to contemplate his death. The Christus Patiens scene here, or the suffering Christ, is going to be the type which becomes more common when the lands of Christianity are attacked by Muslims. So too do we find that Christ is going to be shown suffering in the same way, dead with his head slumping down to the lower right, because that's where the saved are in the Last Judgment. They will be in the left-hand side of the composition versus the damned in the right-hand side, as you see Christ judging above, looking towards the damned. Now, the last period of Byzantine art, or the last golden age, is going to last from 1261 to 1453, or the 2 centuries after recapturing Constantinople from the Fourth Crusade, to the loss, finally, to the Ottoman Turks, and the end of the Byzantine Empire. It was Michael VIII Palaiologos who would recapture Constantinople in 1261, reconstituting only a fragment of the previous. Seen here, the Ottoman Turks are going to control the Asian side of the Golden Horn, and then the Byzantines recapture only a small portion of the northern side, squeezed in between the Kingdom of Bulgaria and that of Serbia. In one of these late Byzantine churches and decorations, the Church of Christ in Kora, which is now a museum, we have a series of frescoes which are much cheaper than mosaic, showing us that the resources the Byzantines had were far fewer in this late period. In this Paracclesian or side burial chapel, we have a very appropriate subject shown. The subject is very common in Byzantine art, but not so much in the West. It is called an anastasis, or a harrowing of hell, in which Christ is going to trample the doors of hell. Once doing so, he is going to take from the tombs all of those that died before he was crucified. Often this shows the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, being pulled from their tombs. Often showing John the Baptist, who was beheaded before Christ died by 6 months. We have the kings from the Old Testament, such as King David, a relative of Christ. King Solomon and other Old Testament prophets are often shown, as well as martyrs who died for the Christian faith before Christ could save. In this eclectic approach, we have a spaceless atmosphere that does not suggest the weighty bulkiness of the figures. Instead, the drapery is now fluid and flat. There is no concern with systematic observation. The figures are shown from different angles and perspectives, recombined on this flat surface, where Christ appears, shimmering in white garb, surrounded by a white oval mandorla, interspersed with the starburst patterns or rosettes. Below him there are 2 doors along with broken locks, with the devil tied up that's going to be subdued. Now in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, and the churches, like the Hagia Sophia, were converted to mosques to benefit this new civilization on the rise in the Byzantine Empire, however, does not fall completely. Russia becomes its heir and adopts Orthodox Christianity and the model of the Byzantine Empire. For, as it is stated, because the old Rome has fallen, and because the second Rome is now in the hands of the godless Turks, thy kingdom, O pious Tsar, is the third Rome. Hence, they are stating that you have Western European Rome, then the Byzantine version of Rome, and now Russia is the third Rome. This lecture looks at Western Europe and what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire, with the rise of those barbarian peoples, as they were known, that would come to dominate the era, looking particularly, first off, at the Hiberno-Saxons and the Vikings. With the fall of Rome and its sack by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410 Common Era, we do know that the Emperor and the Pope were safe in Ravenna, the Byzantine stronghold that we will discuss in the Byzantine section. The barbarians, however, were going to be those individuals who could only barble Greek or Latin, the classical languages that defined civilization as the Roman Empire saw it. Now, exactly who these peoples were is going to vary greatly, given that we do not have a historical record for many of them. We do know that they are outside of Rome's orbit, those that are beyond the borders, say, of Hadrian's Wall, or of Germania, or the Danube, for instance. These are going to be tribes that are going to be organized by families in this tight-knit social organization that is highly nomadic. Now, when Rome falls, we see a massive migration into Europe of these peoples. The wooden architecture that they built and that they lived in is now lost. However, the metalwork and animal geometric ornamentation that they so loved survives, such as the torques we discussed on the dying Gaul and the jewelry that the Gauls wore. To show what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire from 500 to 1000 Common Era, we have these various barbarians flooding into Western Europe, taking hold of territories once controlled by Rome, now splintered into dozens and dozens of smaller principalities and factions, yet at the same time fusing with the Greco-Roman heritage with these northern peoples. We note that the Visigoths, who sacked Rome, will settle in Spain and convert to Christianity. The Burgundians are going to settle in Switzerland and eastern France, giving Burgundy its name. The Franks are going to settle in Germany, France, and Belgium, eventually giving France its name. And the Vandals are going to make their way all the way to North Africa. These groups would, as the Roman Empire had, slowly convert to Christianity, and we find that in the early Middle Ages, where there is a lack of political unity, the church will act as a unifier among the populations that spread out in Western Europe, what is now the UK and North Africa. The Frankish king Clovis I, the founder of the Merovingian dynasty, will be one of the first great examples of this conversion, since he is going to form an alliance with the popes that will last throughout the Middle Ages and all the way into the modern era. This arrangement is going to find kings and nobles that are under the king defending the claims of the Roman Church and that the Pope is the true arbiter of God's message on earth. And in turn, the Pope would validate the authority of the kings, hence the divine right of kings. At this time, we find that the church will be the principal patron of the arts, and so we find their style will be influenced by these quote-unquote barbarian peoples that are going to convert to Christianity, but are going to then present a Christian message with it. For an introduction to the style that these northern peoples preferred, we turn to Scandinavia and Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, where we have several surviving brooches and other decorative elements. Here, with the Gummersmark brooch, we find from Denmark in the 6th century, a small, just under 6-inch high brooch, a decorative element illustrating what we mean by the animal style. Now, the animal style is going to have abstract patterning with animal motifs, specifically serpents, beasts, and squat humans. Along the upper section here, you also see another geometric abstract pattern known as the eye and beak motif. That's going to show that birds will peck out the eyes of victims left on the battlefield. Hence, we have, of course, these tribal associations that value warfare and warriors. In the central section, we find that men will be compressed by dragons. Hence, the northern interest will be carried on when we discuss Vikings here shortly for the love of dragons and serpents. Turning to what we discussed in Islam, we should note that there is an interest that is common among all of these northern peoples in surface ornamentation and abstraction. So as with Islam, we are not going to be moving beyond the surface. It takes quite a while for Western illusionistic classical perspective to seek its way back into the canon of Christian art. The symmetrical compositions are going to be common in both cultures, where we find animals will be shown in profile or from above, strictly speaking, as we saw going back to cave painting. Turning to this style and its introduction to the Hiberno-Saxon area, now we should note that Hiberno-Saxon or Anglo-Saxon both refer to the cultures of the English Isles between the 6th to the 10th century Common Era. The Irish and English islands are going to be given the nickname Hibernia, that is Ireland, by the Romans. Hence we have Hiberno for Hibernia or Ireland, and Saxon for the Saxons who lived there, and ethnic peoples. The Anglo-Saxons and, once again, others will find their way from Germany, while the Utes are going to come from Denmark, settling in southeastern Britain, the main population center in this island. Most of the items created by the Hiberno-Saxons will be small and portable status symbols. They can be found primarily in burial mounds. The best surviving one is going to be found at Sutton Hoo. The burial mound here at Sutton Hoo should remind one of the Cairn Hills or graves we looked at in the Neolithic period from the early prehistoric period in the UK. Now, the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, written between the 8th and 11th centuries, is going to tell us that heroes would be cremated along with, quote, buried rings and brooches in the barrow, all of those ornaments that brave men had brought out from the hoard after Beowulf died, end quote. There is a tradition, hence, in the Anglo-Saxon peoples and era to bury their dead along with the jewelries and status symbols associated with them. Here we have in Beowulf and at Sutton Hoo the description matching up with the ship that was found along with this burial cache or hoard. Now we know that, according to Beowulf, the warrior lord Scyld is going to be laid to rest in a ship and set adrift with treasures and ornaments, as the epic poem states. Among these are 40 gold coins found at Sutton Hoo, paid to 40 oarsmen to help them cross over a body of water, which is very common in most of these civilizations as we discussed. The Greeks and the Romans believed that you needed to cross over the river Styx by way of Charon to get to Hades. We know the Egyptians would cross over the Nile in order to get to the afterlife. Hence, we have several traditions that carry on this understanding, and it is included here in the Anglo-Saxon. Now we have 2 silver spoons inscribed Salos and Palos, also converting and or suggesting this could be the Anglican king Redvald who converted to Christianity, because the biblical story of Saul, who is going to be converted to the Apostle Paul, is going to be a commonly cited example for Christian converts in this era. Now we know that there is even a Byzantine silver bowl found among the items at Sutton Hoo, showing that, like the Vikings after them, the Anglo-Saxons or Hiberno-Saxons are going to trade with far distant civilizations. The items found at Sutton Hoo vary, but can be generally discussed as illustrating the animal style. They are small, and generally the only parts that survive are those metalwork or jewelry aspects. Here, with a hinged clasp of roughly 5 inches in length, we have abstract animal designs. In the millefiore technique, or 1,000 flowers from the Italian, we have it decorated with colored pieces of glass cut into geometric shapes and stylized into these animal forms. Among them, we note that we have blue, red, and black being the primary colors used. The clasp would have been for a leather body armor that would have been worn by the Anglo-Saxons, as seen in many recreations of this myth. So you would hold together the leather armor from the front to the back with these different hinge sections. Much like we discussed with the fibula that go back to the ancient Near East and Greece. If we look at a detail of the hinged clasp, we can see that we have overlapping bores and interlaced snakes. So we find that the snakes will be interlaced, biting each other's tails. That is a motif that carries on around this rectangular section or frame. In addition, we find that the overlapping bores represent strength or bravery for these peoples. So you can see their snouts below as their haunches make their way to the outer rim or sides of this given brooch. Just like the Gummersmark brooch, we find here with the hinge clasp from Sutton Hoo an interest in surface decoration, abstraction, geometric ornamentation, and animals. These motifs will be carried on in the earliest examples of Christianity and its art in the Isles, and we find that they survive here in the Celtic North and West in monasteries as centers of art and learning even after the collapse or fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the monasteries were also isolated and undefended and easy victims for Viking attacks. But while the Vikings stole from and looted these monasteries, they also brought their love for abstract animal patterns or this animal style to the British Isles. In these monasteries, we have scriptoria, or writing studios, where illuminated manuscripts would be created by monks, copying books by hand. The only way information was preserved and carried on, passed down generation to generation. These books often took the form of ceremonial objects carried by deacons in processions, as we saw in many mosaics and illustrations earlier, such as the Justinian mosaic at Ravenna. We find that Christ often will also be shown holding a jewel-encrusted book that would have been hand-copied, illuminated, and illustrated. As one of these, we find an example here with the Book of Duro, where the Gospels are going to begin with a carpet page of pure embellishment, and also include portraits of the authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The books are generally not made with parchment and/or with paper, but instead on vellum or calfskin, making it incredibly durable. Here we have the symbol of Matthew, which is a winged man, which opens the ancestry of Christ. The figure here is going to be frontally posed with his face, hair parted equally in the middle, with his feet in profile. We find that the cloak that he wears is going to flatten out his figure and show us the same interest in abstraction we looked at earlier. The animal style abstraction that we saw with the Gummersmark brooch and Sutton Hoo can be seen here in the intertwining patterns around St. Matthew, as well as the flat millefiore-like technique used to illustrate his body with the checkered pattern of yellow and red and green. One of the most famous examples of this animal style by way of book illumination comes with the Book of Kells. In the Kiroyota, the page here of pure embellishment, which is going to very elegantly outline and detail the first letters of Christ's name in Greek, roughly looking like the English equivalent XPI, often overlapping. We find here at the base in Latin, it begins with the Latin phrase Christi autem generatio, and/or the verse from Matthew 1:18, now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. Hence, of course, beginning the promise of salvation and resurrection. The bottom here, we have highlighted that Latin phrase for clarity. Now, this is not a picture of the actual event of Christ's birth like a nativity scene, but instead pure ornamental celebration, a jubilant celebration of the promise of the Messiah, carried out in that animal abstract style. Now, the Kiroyota is not new. Coming from Greek, this is going to be inspired by not only the Greek Gospels, but the Greek Orthodox religion, where we often find the Kiroyota or XPI overlapping, such as seen here in the shield of Justinian's soldiers. Now, the idea of having an embellishment for a religious work is not new and is not unique to Christianity in the North. As we discussed, in Islamic culture, we find that Qurans are very often going to be embellished with similar geometric ornamentation and/or arabesque whiplash-like designs. The animal style here that is going to be used to illustrate this Christian subject actually is nothing Christian at all about the ornament. It is taken almost entirely from earlier pagan and or barbaric, if we were to use the vernacular of the day, civilizations. So we find that these animal forms are going to be taken because they are appreciated by a recently converted population in the north. Another type of illumination, which is common in these illuminated manuscripts, is that of an author portrait, or a portrait of the author whom we are about to read, such as the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John most commonly. In this particular example, we again have St. Matthew. Now, the model for this Lindisfarne Gospel is actually going to be taken from a classicizing book in Italy. Hence, we have many classical motifs here included. The figure of Matthew, as we see here modeled on these Roman-style books, is going to be seated and dressed as a Roman philosopher with long hair, wearing a toga and sandals, in, once again, this illusionistic space with a curtain being pulled back. As a Greek and Roman-seated philosopher or poet, this is commonly understood as the gospel writers, since they are also very educated and important writers and authors in this classical term and tradition. In turn, the classical motifs which are included here can be seen in the curtain, which is setting the scene indoors. The seat is at an angle, hence suggesting a type of intuitive perspective being used. It is labeled both in Greek and Latin, the most prestigious classical languages at the time, and, of course, Greek is what the New Testament would be written in, and Latin that of the Vulgate. Now, up above, we find that the symbol of St. Matthew is also included in the imago hominis, the image of man. So both the angel and the man are both present, indicating the presence of this gospel writer. Now again, we find that this is going to be still seen through the lens of the Hiberno-Saxons, and so we are uninterested in volume. We find that the forms are conceived in terms of line and color. This linear idiom is going to carry through until we reach the Carolingian Renaissance. Turning our attention back to Scandinavia, we have the main Viking routes opening up in 792 to 870, and we find that they will spread their culture throughout Western and Eastern Europe, making their way all the way to the Americas. Their name coming from Viken, or the people from the coves. We know that the French are going to find them so bothersome, they buy them off by giving them a section of northern France, still called Normandy to this day, for Northmen. Now, they sent out flotillas of up to 350 ships across Europe and the Atlantic through the 9th and 10th centuries, sailing nearly 200 miles a day. We know, famously, that Leif Erikson reached North America in the year 1000, well ahead of Christopher Columbus and his exploits. The ships with which the Vikings sailed the seas are often decorated with sleek sea serpents. They are used for burials and journeys, especially passages to Valhalla, used to hasten the journey to the afterlife. Here at Oslo, we have the Osberg ship, which was looted and is 75 feet long, but it was originally for 2 women, a queen and her companion, along with 12 horses, dogs, and an ox. Even though the hoard was looted, the ship remains intact and gives us a good indication as to how the Vikings make a very shallow draft in a ship that is both seaworthy and capable of sailing up shallow rivers. The same carries on from that earlier burial ship that we looked at from Sutton Hoo, showing that the same cultures were communicating and sharing technological innovations and ideas. The prow of the ship is going to spiral into a serpent's head. The bands of interlacing animals surrounding it, including dragons, carry on that interest in the animal style that so dominated the era before, such as what we looked at with the Gummismark brooch. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth is going to order that many stones be placed near a smaller rune stone to celebrate the fact that he had Christianized the Danes. When these peoples of the north, the Vikings, become Christian, they adopt or use many of their same interests and integrate Christian symbolism and iconography into them. In this instance, we have a rune stone which was commissioned for inscriptions. An early version of the Germanic alphabet can be seen to the left, while a picture stone would be commissioned in order to illustrate the significance of the rune stone, this one having figural decoration. On the inscription, we hear that, at 8 feet tall, King Harald had this memorial made for Gorm, his father, and Thyra, his mother, won for himself all Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christians. Hence we are celebrating as a standard stele motif going back to the ancient Middle East, that something has happened. There is an event this is recording, and that is the Christianization of this area in Denmark. This new style that accompanies it in the picture stone is going to combine the interlacing foliage and ribbons along with animals that were appropriate and were popular in the north. Here we have a stone that was originally brightly polychromed, showing us Christ, who is in a crucifixion pose, with ribbons that are going to be wound around him, much like serpents that are intertwined, biting one another. Christ here is robed, in fact, in a Byzantine manner, showing the connections that the Vikings had with Byzantium and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. His arms are outstretched and entangled and double-ribboned, interlaced, in this instance, instead of nailed to a cross. Hence, as with many cultures, we first celebrate Christianity for its promise of renewed life. And so whether it be in Africa, Central or South America, or in this case in Scandinavia, local inhabitants that convert to Christianity prefer to be reminded of the promise of life, not death. Here is another version of it that was repainted, illustrating it more clearly with the figure of Christ, his arms outstretched, eyes open, the promise of eternal life, that you will live forever. Now, the interlacing ribbons should remind one of the interlacing dragon and serpent motifs that were found on the ships. Therefore, the style is still going to be of a pre-Christian era and is one of a traditional Scandinavian one, not of the classical Christian tradition. Turning to the imagery, we know that these individuals in the north would have had contact with the Byzantine Christians for the iconic presentation, and the imagery chosen is going to be much more closely associated with the Byzantine culture. Finally, when considering Christian architecture in churches in the north, we see that they still incorporate northern decorative motifs and engineering technology. Here we find that Scandinavia becomes officially Christian in 1015, so most of the churches are built thereafter. The types of churches are telling because they are known as stave churches, named for the 4 huge timbers or staves that support a central roof. We can, of course, tell what the climate is and the rate of precipitation annually when looking at the roofs of these various structures. For if there is low precipitation annually, the roof will be relatively flat. The more snow and rain there is, the sharper the elevation and the cantilevering is of the roof. Looking in the center, we note that these churches are very tall, but quite narrow, only being able to hold a very small parish or village. The staves can be seen in the massive timbers holding it up on each side. We still have the same terminology used in these churches, however, for we still have a nave, where we're standing right now, side aisles off to the sides here with benches for people to sit, and still a high altar and a pulpit, all still carrying on this very traditional Christian basilica imagery. However, on the exterior, we have something that is uniquely Scandinavian. On the gables, there are in fact dragon heads with crosses to protect the church and the congregation from trolls and other demons that were believed to lurk in the mountains and the woods. This lecture looks at the early medieval period with the emergence of the Carolingian and Ottonians. The Carolingian period is defined by the reign of Charlemagne, in Latin Carolus Magnus, or Charles the Great. He would consolidate the Frankish kingdoms, defeat the barbaric Lombards, as they were known at the time, and Christianize the Germans, or Saxons, in northern Germania. In a very famous bloody verdict of Verdun, 4,500 chieftains were condemned to death, for they would not convert to Christianity. So we find that Charlemagne conducts a rather effective, transformative campaign, unifying all of Western Europe under one religion. In his new Holy Roman Empire, known here as the Renovatio Imperii Romani, the renewal of the Roman Empire, he sought to reconstitute what was the Roman Empire in the West and revive the classical tradition by way of education especially. Now, the Carolingian Empire is going to encompass modern-day Germany, France, Italy, and the Low Countries, all of which are going to be controlled by one emperor. The capital of this vast empire is going to be found at Aachen, which at this time was the intellectual center of Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance, as it became known, is going to be defined by the rise in education and of literacy, thanks to the numerous free schools that Charlemagne opens across the empire to increase literacy among his peoples. He knew that he must elevate them by way of education if we were to make our way out of the Dark Ages. He even learned to read and write himself at a time when few rulers could even recite the alphabet. They, of course, needn't had learned how to read and write because they had scribes to do that. That is how important Charlemagne thought that education was. He would be crowned for all of his various accomplishments, the Holy Roman Emperor, by Pope Leo III in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in the year 800. At that time, he had already ruled for several decades. Of course, this is just going to cement his legacy throughout history, as the Pope declares him successor to Constantine, the first Christian emperor. This, of course, reinforces the bond between the Church and Western secular government, established first by the Frankish king Clovis I. In order to illustrate this newly refounded Roman Empire, Charlemagne wasted no time showing himself as one in the imperial garb one would expect. Here we have a said equestrian portrait. Though a statuette and small, it still has all of the trappings of the regal Roman imperial period. Here, as a successor to Rome's Christian emperors, we have Charlemagne dressed in imperial robes, holding a globe, and of course crowned, showing that he is going to rule over the globe. World domination is going to be the communication here, as he is going to command the steed, representing the peoples that he rules over. On his crown, we have an early version of the fleur-de-lis, or the lily, that would come to stand for or be a symbol of the French kings after him. Of course, the first emperor that we have associated with an equestrian statue and who was Christian is that of Constantine. Unfortunately, we find that Christians in the early Middle Ages mistake this statue of Marcus Aurelius for Constantine. Regardless, we find that this becomes the touchstone for all equestrian portraits thereafter. And so we find that showing oneself on horseback has a direct correlation to this first Christian emperor, as he is seen as a new Christian emperor ruling over a reconstituted Roman Empire in the West, astride a horse that is also very small by proportion. However, we find that he does not wear a beard like all of the emperors after Hadrian until Constantine. Instead, he is going to have a mustache. This is going to be significant. The mustache, in fact, is a sign of nobility for the Franks, his peoples that can trace their lineage back to the Merovingians and Clovis I. These can also trace their lineage back to the Gauls, or Celts. If you remember, the Gauls are going to be a fearsome fighting clan that will be fought by various Greek peoples and the Romans themselves, including Julius Caesar. They are identified in art as having a mustache, a very clearly identifiable facial feature. So this, of course, ties him to the tradition of these early Gauls. To celebrate his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor, we are told that this coronation gospel was commissioned right after and took around a decade to complete and decorate. Painted with ink and tempera on vellum, or calfskin, we have this wonderfully surviving dyed purple, hence the color of royalty in the Roman Empire, wonderful gospel that survives, supposedly taken from his coffin or from his sarcophagus by his grandson, one of the Ottos. So here we find St. Matthew is shown writing the gospel in a very classically inspired image. The illusionistic aspects here are going to be communicated by way of modulation instead of line. So we find that shadows are going to be cast between, say, the legs and or the toga, or leading from the lectern into the background, instead of merely having a linearity carved into the scene. The Roman accessories, or classical accessories we might state, include a cross-legged chair, a lectern, he's wearing a toga, we are in a landscape. The frame as well is also going to be a classical motif, as it has acanthus leaves on it. If we are to compare this to the earlier Lindisfarne Gospel with St. Matthew, we can see that Charlemagne is very self-consciously modeling his works after that of the classical Gospel books they're getting from Rome. We find that the motifs, along with and combined with that interest in illusionism, in the traditional modulation that comes from antiquity, is going to signal that he is reaching back to the era of Constantine, of the original Roman emperors. Now, the architectural models we might add for Aachen, the capital of the Carolingian Empire, are going to be found in Rome and Ravenna, those areas where we find imperial connotations from the Western emperors and the Byzantine Eastern emperors. Here, the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne at Aachen is going to show us what Carolingian architecture is going to bequeath to the future, which is the Romanesque era. Here we have the Church of the Imperial Court, the repository for relics, including Charlemagne's own, and a mausoleum to the dead Charlemagne. Out front, we find a Westwerk and or a western front or facade, which is going to become common in the next period. That addition of the western entrance is going to lead to our modern understanding of what a church facade is. Now, the ground floor here with the narthex in the upper story of the throne room can be seen in this section or this drawing of the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne, his private chapel, much like you would have the Sistine Chapel for the Pope. The tribune, as seen here on the second level, would have the throne of Charlemagne himself, as he could witness the Mass happening below. This is, in fact, the first vaulted structure of the Middle Ages north of the Alps. And we find that most of those basilicas in the north are going to be wooden. Hence, this obviously is going to be modeled on Byzantine precedent. And that can be seen in the mosaics above. The golden mosaics were, in fact, inspired by Byzantine precedents, where we find Christ judging here as Pantocrator, surrounded by the four symbols of the gospel writers and the holy elect below. The model for this is actually going to also have imperial connotations, for Justinian built San Vitale in Ravenna. So, of course, Charlemagne wants to be a new Roman emperor like him. If we look at the plan for San Vitale and the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne, it becomes clear that the octagonal, concentric, overlapping geometric structure of San Vitale is simplified here by Charlemagne's architects and is much more centralized. Above the portal, we find that Charlemagne could view the atrium in front of this marble throne looking down upon the procession, modeled on the imperial gallery from Hagia Sophia. Here we have said throne that Charlemagne would have sat at himself. It is heavy, weighty, strong, austere, like the architecture he's responsible for. This is modeled after, again, the imperial gallery at Hagia Sophia, where the Emperor Justinian would have also sat, again relating Charlemagne to a previous Roman emperor. And like these earlier Byzantine churches, we find that the Palatine Chapel would have been seen in these segmented or fragmented sections because you're always behind a column or a section of the church. However, we do not have the floating quality of light that is so common in Byzantine architecture. Instead, there is a new, robust strength and structural clarity to the architecture that is darker on the interior, but we can see clearly how it's going to stand up, how it's going to be constructed. This foreshadows the next version of architecture and style in the Romanesque. The Westwerk as well is going to communicate as it's carried on in the Carolingian and Ottonian eras. The strong, austere, and unornamented approach, which communicates the physical and the military might of Charlemagne and his grandsons after him. Charlemagne reigned for a very long time, and so it would be his grandsons that would inherit, by Frankish law, equal sections of his vast empire. They, in fact, break it into 3 different sections. Slowly, we can see emerging modern Western Europe, with France in the west, the Netherlands and Belgium in the center, along with Switzerland, and then Italy, and then finally Germany and Austria in the east. This is going to find Charles the Bald, Lothar, and Louis the German in the west, central, and eastern sections of the empire ruling. They are called the Ottos, hence this is the Ottonian period. The 3 Ottos, in fact, are going to, thanks to Frankish inheritance, divide this vast kingdom evenly among them. They would cement ties with the papacy, ensuring that Catholic Christianity is the only religion that would be practiced in their realm. They as well continue the Christianization begun by their grandfather, finally succeeding in Christianizing the Vikings in Scandinavia. They also reform the monasteries and are responsible for many new building campaigns, including monasteries and abbeys. The basilica plans of early Christian churches were also revived under the 3 Ottos in the Ottonian era, and we find that many new churches are built based on those that were studied in ancient Rome. St. Michael's at Hildesheim, in fact, in Germany, is a great example of this renewed building vigor. Here we find that Bishop Bernard of Hildesheim, the tutor to Otto III, would travel to Rome studying the monuments there. Returning to modern-day Germany, he would be the architect for several structures, including the one seen here, named for the Archangel. The plan, in fact, is going to be modeled on what he was very impressed by seeing, which is the Basilica Ulpia of Trajan, which has dual apses. Hence, of course, St. Michael's at Hildesheim also has 2 apses. In addition, St. Michael's is also a modular design, built around a module of the crossing, the most common type of modular design, whereas there is a 3-dimensional unit of space that is then repeated to form the transept and then the nave. This is going to make a very logical interior space that rationally relates to one another. With the alternating white and red motifs, we are also reminded of the early Visigothic Christian churches and the great mosque at Cordoba. Originally, the interior walls in the clear story above would have been covered in decorations, much like the typological narrative scenes that are still seen on the door today. Here are the doors of St. Michael's at Hildesheim, which are also based again on early Christian models, specifically the wooden doors of Santa Sabina in Rome. Cast in a single piece, we have massive, nearly 17 feet tall doors with 16 panels from the Old and New Testament, illustrating typological associations. In them, we find that we move at the top left with the Old Testament scene of the creation of Eve, down through the version of Cain and Abel. We then move from the bottom, or the New Testament scenes from the Annunciation, all the way up to the appearance of the risen Christ to Mary Magdalene. The significance of these pairings should not go understated or overlooked. They, in fact, are an example of typology, or a study of types, in which we find, since the early Christian period, there was an effort by the ecclesiastical leaders of Christianity to compare the New Testament to the Old Testament, to show how the New Testament builds on the Old Testament with these prophecies. They are similar. So, for instance, at the bottom we find Eve's children, Cain and Abel, next to Mary's child. Then we have life in the world as Adam and Eve are cast out, and the infancy of Christ as they are also cast out into the world, fleeing Herod. Next we have the fall and the passion. The fall of man, of course, is going to be when original sin is brought into the world. The passion, or when Christ is crucified, is when we are redeemed from it. And finally, we have life in paradise with Adam and Eve, and the promise of return to paradise with Christ resurrected, as we will all be resurrected. In one of these scenes, to illustrate that, we have the fall and the crucifixion. These are very often paired in the Christian mind and are still compared in sermons today. Here we have the style that was popular during the era, influenced by, again, that early Christian style that emphasizes simplicity with a very clear setting so that we understand the emotional impact very directly. In this instance, we have God here presented as Christ with a cruciform halo, still wearing his traditional beard, toga, and holding, once again, his testament. He is rebuking Adam, pointing with his left hand, right? The rebuking left hand that is going to judge the damned. Pointing in an accusatory fashion, Adam then covers up his nudity next to this very tropical tree. He then also points to Eve behind him, who in turn covers up and points down to the serpent below her. Even if we are an illiterate audience and have never read the Bible, we can clearly piece together the story here thanks to these very clear gestures. The emotional impact and the internal torment of Adam and Eve made also evident. As Christ here, as part of the Godhead, because we do not show God the Father, is going to be pointing, accusing Adam of violating what he promised he would not, that being eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam then blames Eve and states that no, it was her. Eve then points down to the serpent and says, no, it was the serpent. The style here and the typological association goes back to the earliest examples of early Christian art that we looked at, such as the sarcophagus of Unius Bassus, where we have short, wide, stout, and squat figures, a limited background, and of course a limited set of suggestions as to place us where we are in history and or the locale. Thus, of course, the message is paramount, and it is very clear here, even to an illiterate audience. Turning to the crucifix commissioned by Archbishop Gero, otherwise known as the Gero crucifix, we have a 6'2" tall monumental sculpture, one of the first of its kind, reviving monumental sculpture, though not yet in stone. Instead, we here have a statue that functions as a reliquary. Hence, we find that it holds a relic and/or an object associated with a holy person. Most commonly, parts of their bodies, such as bones, skin, hair, but could also be clothing, such as the Shroud of Turin, for instance, or Veronica's veil. Here, instead of the triumphant Christ who has overcome death and has risen, we now have the suffering Christ, the Christus Patiens, and he now is bearded and dead. His body sags limp. He looks down to his right. This is influenced not by the Hiberno-Saxons in the north, but instead by the Byzantines. The Byzantine version of the dead Christ is significant here because we find that the Ottonians are going to align themselves with many customs associated with the Byzantines. The Christus Patiens is just one example here, as he is bearded and broken. And of course, we are emphasizing contours and chrysography, the outlines that are so common, yet mixing the classical bulk and clarity that Middle Byzantine art is so known for at the same time. Now, Otto III will move his capital to Rome, right, instead of the north at Aachen, where his grandfather had the capital. This is going to coincide with a turn to Byzantine imperial rituals. They dress like Byzantine emperors, and they're going to carry out and emulate those in the Christian East. Not surprising then, the illuminated manuscripts reflect Byzantine models as well. Here we find the Aachen Gospels of Otto III, completed around the year 1000. In this instance, we have Christ washing the feet of his disciples. Now, the Ottonians are going to be looking to manuscripts of the Byzantines that could easily be brought over to the West and copied. Comparing it to Byzantine examples we've seen before, there is an emphasis on outline and contour as well as stylization. So we notice that we are mixing the classical tradition, yet subduing it for expressive purposes. The figures are elongated, the contours clear and outlined. Thus, this becomes the style that will be dominant and inform the next period of art in the West. Thus, the Ottonian style becomes the Romanesque figural style, which is attenuated or elongated in its features. It has expressive figures that move beyond the classical tradition of naturalism and careful balance and order. Next time, we'll continue on with the emergence of the Romanesque after the year 1000 and the promise that God would not destroy the world at the millennium. This sees the rise of monumental stone sculpture and architecture once again.